Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this breakfast meeting here at Bergen Global, where we are going to talk about where Russia is headed. Today's heading is where Russia is headed, public opinion and silent opposition. And I'd like to welcome all of you here in the audience present, and also those of us who follow us digitally on Zoom today. Russia and Russian independent polling agencies report high levels of support for President Putin, even after the invasion of Ukraine, which took place February this year, and the military mobilization. How reliable are these polls? Life in Russia has not been more restricted since the end of the Soviet Union, with the arrest of political opponents, closing of offices of independent media, and fines for criticizing the government. The freedoms of the Russian population are eroding. The numbers of people who truly support Putin is unknown. But can the make it or break it for the future of Russia, these numbers and the support for Putin? Is it at all possible to estimate the popular support for Putin's regime? Is there room for opposition and critical thinking? And how can a re-democratization process of Russia come about? My name is Martin Poulsen. I'm head of department at the Department of Foreign Languages here at the University of Bergen. I'm happy that we have been able to put together this panel as a collaboration between the Faculty of Humanities in our Department of Foreign Languages and the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Department of Comparative Politics. I've been asked to moderate today's breakfast meeting between two highly qualified researchers with different approaches to understanding contemporary Russia. Kyle Marked, who is sitting closest to me, from the Department of Comparative Politics, will share his research on variation in support for President Vladimir Putin, and Irina Anisimova at the far end from my own department, the Department of Foreign Languages, will talk about the Russian opposition movements. Kyle, over the last years, Russia has developed into a more and more authoritarian regime, where the results of elections are given before the votes are even counted. Why should we care about approval ratings in Russia?
Well, yeah, that's sort of the key question here. And I think that there's a couple of different answers to it. So the first answer is more along the lines of, actually, the real reason why we really need these data are exactly what you just mentioned, which is that in general, in democracies, the reason people care about approval ratings is because they reflect the probability that someone will win an election, right? Whereas in Russia, that's obviously not the case. And so, especially because they're actually like falsifying election returns in many different regions of Russia, some more than others, there's sort of this question of, we don't really have any good sense of how popular Putin actually is based on sort of election results or anything like that. So really the only data we have are based on public opinion polling. So the question then becomes, if we don't really, if the public opinion doesn't matter necessarily for retention of power, why do we care about it? And the answer is sort of twofold. The first one is that in general, Russia today is still not Stalinist, right? So even though civil liberties are eroding, there's still a fair amount of freedom to sort of express oneself and still the ability to discuss, at least personally, like opinions, right? And what this means is, for the government in particular, is that it does not need to rely as much on things like repression. So for example, if you have a lower, if you're more popular, it means that you can actually spend more of your resources doing other things as opposed to investing in, say, state security apparatuses, or actually having to put down protests continually, especially those that are mass supported, right? So if you have, and both of these things are really important, because if you have mass protests that are also supported by the population, that's obviously a very risky thing. And I think Ukraine is actually the case in point here. So for example, the revolution and dignitary, the Orange Revolution, were protests that were backed by a large proportion of the population, and which led to the downfall of two autocratic regimes or autocratizing regimes in Ukraine, which obviously like Russia and Putin learned a lot from. So what this means is that like by maintaining popularity, you can maintain some degree of stability. The other thing is that you don't have to invest as much in sort of supporting security services, which means that you don't have to create potential elite level power figures, or it at least means that you're less reliant upon them for your popular support. And the reason why that's important for someone like Putin is that it reduces the risk of sort of another person being as powerful or a competing power center within the Kremlin, which is another huge risk for autocratic regimes like Russia. So what all this means is that public opinion is very important for regime stability. And for the purposes of people like us who are sort of observing Russia, what this means is that looking at trends in public opinion and approval for Putin over time gives us a sense of the stability of the regime. Now, this also brings up a bunch of other questions of like, what do these numbers actually mean? And if anyone tells you that there's one thing that they mean, they're misguided, right? So what does it mean when someone says in Russia, if you're asked, if a person in Russia is asked, do you support the activities of President Putin? If they say yes, that doesn't mean that they're like full-hearted supporters of the president. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily that they're full supporters of the war in Ukraine. It means a bunch of different things, all of which sort of come together in this one question, right? And so with this one question, we can't really say what exactly it means directly, but what we can do is we can tell things about trends over time, right? So if we see that public opinion is increasing or public opinion and support for Putin is increasing, it means that the stability of the regime is probably greater than it was before. If it starts drastically decreasing, that's an indication that potentially there's going to be less stability in the government. So is there like any cutoff point where we say that the regime's in trouble? No, right? Because like, what does 30% support mean? What does 40% approval mean? It means very sort of different things based on sort of the trajectory and other things happening in the government. But altogether, these gives us a sense of how stable and sort of the trends in Russian politics.
Thank you. I think that there are several things in there that I'd like to return to, but I'd also like to bring Irina into the conversation. And while Kyle here is associate professor at the Department of Comparative Politics and focuses on issues of identity and public opinion in the former Soviet Union, your field, Irina, working in the Department of Foreign Languages, is the connection between contemporary Russian culture and politics and the opposition movement in Russia today. I would like to ask you, since Russia invaded Ukraine, we have had news reports of thousands and thousands of Russians leaving the country. Among them, many critics of the current political leadership in the country. Is there any opposition left in Russia now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. To begin with, of course, Russian opposition had a lot of problems for a very long time. We have so-called системная оппозиция or systemic opposition, the opposition that has been present in the parliament but was approved by the government. So they were not really fighting for power. And then all the oppositional activities in recent years have moved into the municipal elections and municipal activities. But of course, municipal deputies have very little power in Russia. There are still some oppositional deputies left in Russia who haven't immigrated. But some of them actually have faced a lot of repressions and even have been imprisoned, somebody like Ilya Yashin. So the most prominent deputies have been put into prisons. But then it's also important to remember that immigration no longer means complete isolation because of the internet. And then people who have left Russia aspire to influence Russian population from abroad. So they create all sorts of, they continue their old activities, and there have been also new projects. For example, we can think about one very interesting development. the meeting of so-called nationalities of Russia movement. And these were basically ethnic activists who want to change Russian attitudes towards ethnic minorities in Russia, ethnic republics, to have a change in terms of federal status of these republics. So they have met this summer in Poland, I believe. In Prague, sorry, in the Czech Republic. And so that has been an interesting development. There have also been some artistic movements a little bit closer to my research, and I will talk a little about this later as well. And also we can think about other forms of discontents that is still maybe just beginning, the discontents connected to mobilization. So there has just been opened a council of soldiers, mothers, and wives that express discontents about the mobilization and the way that people are treated, the way that they are sent to the front, the lack of equipment. Also the mobilized soldiers themselves, because they have access to the internet, they have been posting a lot of videos about the appalling conditions that they have to face. Also, we have to say that this discontents is quite, we could say, one-sided. It focuses on the lack of equipment, on bad conditions, but it doesn't yet raise the questions, the bigger political questions. For example, the war itself, they don't question the fact that whether the war is just, for example, or even sometimes they support the war.
Can I interrupt you on that? Because that's a very interesting point you're mentioning there, Irina, the fact that some of the protests we are seeing regarding the mobilizations do not take issue with the war itself. Is there a particular reason for that? Is it because they don't oppose the war, or are there tactical considerations behind that within that movement, do you think?
Yeah, I actually was thinking about this yesterday. As this movement is growing, you know, especially this council of mothers and wives, I think it's both. So on one hand, maybe some people already start to have reservations, but they know that if they express them directly, their activities would be thwarted. So I think in order to be more effective, they don't want to become political or overtly political. They do not criticize Putin directly. They don't criticize the war directly. But then there are a lot of people in these groups that genuinely support the war. They have a lot of these conspiracy ideas, conspiracy theory ideas. For example, the leader of this council is a very kind of conspiratorially minded person. So I think it's a mix of those two issues that they want. It's kind of the same way that in the environmental movement in Russia also tried to avoid being directly political so that they could advance the issues of the environment. So now we see the same development within this anti-mobilization, or not anti-mobilization, but improved mobilization movement, we could say.
Thank you. And I think also that the variety within the opposition and the different shades of politics in the opposition is something that we can return to, Irina. Kyle, when you started presenting your view on the pollings in Russia and the approval ratings, it struck me the question, for whom are they more important? For the political regime in Russia and for Putin himself, or for us as outside observers? Does Putin care as much about it as we do?
I think we care about it in different ways, right? So So I mean, like the thing that you hinted at the very beginning is that public support for Putin has always been very, very high based on public opinion ratings. So like, actually, I think I have a slide or two that I can maybe exactly. Right. So this is showing basically a complete time series from the Levada Center about popular support for Putin. So nationally representative surveys. And what you'll notice here, and so this is the proportion of people who say that they support the activities of Russian President Putin. And what you'll notice is that this almost never goes below 60%, right? So that means that a large majority of the Russian population has said that they support Putin across pretty much all time, right? And like by way of reference, someone like President Biden in the United States rarely gets above 40, 43%, right? So this is incredibly high popularity, right? And so I think like for someone like Putin, this is like very good things to see and a good sort of like propaganda almost, right? Like to say that like Russians overwhelmingly support the president. That said, as I mentioned earlier, there's a fair amount of variation also within this sort of like rubric of being largely supportive. Like it has ranged from somewhere almost close to 90% after the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and then going down to almost below 60%, actually slightly below 60% very briefly, after some really unpopular pension reforms. So for Putin, again, like something like this shows like what he wants to present about himself to the world and to the Russian people, that he's a popular leader and that Russians in general support him, right? For someone like you or I, like one thing to look at here is not necessarily the absolute amount, because again, what does this actually mean? No one can really tell you, but to rather tell you like trends over time, right? So like right now, after the second invasion of Ukraine, you have this relatively high proportion of people who have increased their support for Putin. Again, like what exactly that means? Is it that like people are now much more supportive of the president, or is it because they're supporting their troops and expressing that by saying they support the president? Again, is something that's kind of unclear, but is again sort of a good signal for the popularity. The other thing that's worth looking at here is like relative popularity, right? So this is showing the relative popularity of Putin versus a bunch of other political figures, both in Russia and abroad. The actual figures are not so much important. So, but the key sort of thing is that Putin is always above them, right? So when we ask about support for people like Angela Merkel, people like members of the systemic opposition, or someone like Alexei Navalny, who's probably the most famous opposition activist in Russia right now, who's currently in jail, Putin is much above them, right? So the second highest person, which is actually a really light green line that you can't see, is Stalin, and then Navalny is relatively low relative to other sort of political figures. Again, what exactly this means is this means that like Navalny at the time in 2021 was actually 40%, 43% less popular than Putin. Well, technically, yes, it does, because that's the actual ratings. But like, does that mean that like, what does that mean in sort of an absolute amount of like support and popularity is kind of unclear, right? Because like something like this is also mixed in with questions of how much are people even aware of Navalny? How much are people aware of these other political figures? But like, again, this basically gives us a sense that when we're talking about popularity in Russia, it still is very much a one-man show. Mm-hmm.
And of course, when we talk about these figures, it's also important for us to understand who conduct the pollings, mm-hmm. Who are behind them. Could you say a little bit about that?
So there are a bunch of different survey firms in Russia. Some of them are regime affiliated. So Vetsion, which is also probably the second most famous survey firm, has sort of longstanding ties with the Russian government. And then you have sort of newer online polling organizations, which have become increasingly popular all over the world, and they're also active. But the data that I'm showing you is coming from the Levada Center, which is sort of an internationally renowned, considered very objective, and definitely sort of like I would say in the world, in sort of worldwide scale, probably one of the best polling organizations in the world, right, objectively. Mm. And so like, and I would say that they are relatively independent of the government. Obviously, they can't break laws, right? So like they're not going to start asking about things that are now illegal to ask about or anything like that. But in general, the data are, I would say, relatively as good as you can get in a situation.
Mm. And we've seen, as Irina hinted to, that the development even before 2022 for a long time has been one towards more restrictions across all of Russian society, including media, freedom of expression, freedom of press. Has this had any influence on the opportunity, the possibility of conducting such polls?
Well, so as with everything else, there's a couple of different elements to this question. One sort of big thing that has often been raised when we're discussing polls in authoritarian contexts and in Russia in particular is, are people actually telling us the truth, right? So like I've already mentioned that what does support mean is kind of a very vague, difficult to answer question, but like a huge potential issue would be if all of a sudden people are afraid to say whether or not they actually support Putin. And so they automatically say, yes, we support, because they're afraid of telling the truth, right? If people are afraid of saying that they don't support Putin. I think probably the best evidence against something like this is actually this time series, which shows that like at different points in time, people have been willing to say that they are less and more likely to support Putin. And even now, like you have 15% of the population that's willing to say that they disapprove of the activities of the president. Now, again, what does all this mean is, again, it's kind of unclear. But like, I think the fact that there is such variation over time is an indication that social desirability bias or preference falsification, which are sort of the two terms of the art for people who are falsifying their preferences, hence preference falsification, there's very little evidence for that. Actually, with colleagues, I've been working on several projects looking at this in more detail. And what we've generally found is that when we use specific statistical techniques, such as list experiments, to see whether or not people are reporting accurately their support for Putin. So what a list experiment basically allows respondents to do is to say that they do or do not support a political figure without actually having to say it directly. Most of the evidence we've had is consistent with the argument that Putin is roughly as popular as the public opinion polls say. Again, whatever popularity means. So there's no evidence that we have gathered thus far that indicates that there is significant preference falsification in Russia. Obviously, things can change as Russia becomes more oppressive, more repressive. Then people might have more of an incentive to falsify their reports. But again, as of yet, we don't have any information about that, or any information that would support that. The other thing that's worth noting here is that the other way that people will often get out of answering questions or not have to say something that they're afraid to say is item non-response. So when you have a survey, like you have people knocking, well, when Levada does face-to-face surveys, which means that they have people knocking on doors, asking if they can conduct an interview and then doing the interview. So people have the right to refuse that at any point, right? So like there's no evidence that this sort of non-response has increased in the past year with Levada. There's also item non-response, which is that when you ask about specific questions, people can say like, I refuse to answer this question about Putin. And Putin actually tends to be one of the relatively lowest, in terms of item non-response, one of the lowest figures. So around 2%, somewhere between 1% and 4% across all the different ways that we've done it have said, we refuse to answer this question, which is, again, not zero, but lower than other political figures. So in general, what we've observed is that item non-response is higher for figures that people don't know. So like we asked in a couple of surveys about support for Nelson Mandela. The reason for that is sort of long and complicated, but there we had like 12 to 14% non-response, not because Nelson Mandela is particularly sensitive in the Russian context, but rather because people just don't know who he is.
So could you say that it means that people have an opinion on Putin and are prepared to share it?
I think, yeah, that would be my interpretation of that. Yeah. Again, they have opinions, and in general, they're not refusing to respond.
Since you pulled up this graphs and especially the first one you showed us, there's one question I feel almost obliged to ask. If you see the two sharpest rises in popularity for Putin, is it correct to say that both of them are related to wars?
Yeah, both of them definitely correspond to war, like, yeah, invasions of Ukraine, right?
So the first one, which we see in 2014, is correlating with the annexation of Crimea.
Exactly.
And the second one, which we see is it late 2021 or early 2022, correlates to either the aggression towards Ukraine or the invasion in February.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's quite strong figures in terms of the popularity of war, or how should we interpret it?
Well, this is like a very sort of common phenomenon. Like if you look at, so I mentioned President Biden in the United States, right? Relatively low popularity based on, well, Putin. But like there are rare contexts where like American presidents get above 50%, and like one of them was the Iraq War, right? So like you have these rallying effects that often happen across regimes where there's like an invasion or something where people are more likely to report support for a regime. Now, again, like, what does that actually mean? Does it mean, do they support the troops? Does it mean that they feel compelled to show solidarity? Does it mean that they have increased their support for Putin? Like, that's sort of like another sort of research agenda, another sort of set of questions to ask. But yeah, both of these have corresponded to the annexation of Crimea and the current invasion.
Irina, I'll pull up a question that I haven't really prepared you for, but I'll try anyway.
Okay.
And it's about the understanding among the political opposition in Russia, or the parts of society in Russia that are critical to Putin. How do they relate to these figures? Because these figures are widely known in Russia, that the popularity of Putin is quite high in these polls. How do people talk about them and relate to them in public discourse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are different trends, I would say, of the way that people talk about this. So there is despair on one hand. So a discourse of despair is kind of the way that opposition sometimes talks very negatively about the broader public. And there is even a term for this, bydlo massa, which is a very negative term to describe the general population, the lower classes. Basically, it's like, you know, basically the lower class. And then some of opposition figures just accuse general public of being too gullible, uneducated, politically inert, things like that. So very negative. Then there is another trend which says that, okay, we don't believe the numbers. This is an authoritarian regime. People are afraid. The regime is going towards totalitarian. So we choose not to believe these numbers. These numbers are not relevant for us. And then the third trend is to say that what Kyle already referred to say that this is one of the propaganda techniques, to constantly refer back to the numbers, say the numbers are high. So it's a little bit goes back to we don't believe the numbers, but it's more nuanced view that, okay, the numbers are a part of propaganda. Maybe the questions are a little bit skewed. The pollsters don't report how many people refuse to answer the questions. So all sorts of explanations of why this shouldn't be fully believed, and at the same time is used by the regime as a propaganda technique. And actually there was a report from the journal Insider that the opposition widely cited, and that kind of partially supported this propaganda description, because they basically, the Insider report looked into different questions. I'm not sure to what extent, I'm not the specialist on this, I'm not like Kyle, but it was a very long and interesting report to describe kind of the techniques that the pollsters use. And that was quite critical towards those techniques.
Kyle, is this something you are familiar with, this criticism that comes up from the political opposition in Russia towards the polling and the techniques?
Well, I mean, so with the techniques, I think most, like, again, Levada uses internationally well-regarded techniques, right? So I think there are a lot of things you can criticize about this. Again, like if we interpret like support for Putin like as being some sort of real thing, then it becomes a much more problematic measure, right? But I think like being humble about the results and also understanding that if we ask the question in different ways, so like this is, again, like universal in public opinion polling. If you ask people about like, do you trust the president? Do you support the president? Like, if you give them some sort of framing or some sort of prime, like you can get very different answers, right? So again, the reason this is worthwhile to look at and worthwhile to study is because we have a time series. We have an ability to compare trends over time and see, like, is it going up? Is it going down? Right? And then the other thing that we have is like a way of sort of comparing Putin roughly to other political figures. Though one thing that is really critical to mention here is that one of the reasons why Putin is so popular is because part of his regime's strategy has been to systematically undermine any opportunity for opposition, right? So like it really is sort of one of those things where they sort of created a system in which there is sort of like one sort of figure at the top that is sort of the most relevant figure and the person that people think about when they think about the government. One thing that is worth noting, actually kind of along the lines of the propaganda, is I don't know if I can actually slow this. I'm not going to go into too much detail with this slide, but it's worth noting that with some colleagues, John Reuter at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Katerina Tertichная at UCL, and Noah Buckley at Trinity College Dublin, we did a survey where we basically looked to see, like, to what extent is Putin's popularity endogenous? So to what extent can we explain support for Putin by perceptions of popularity? And this is just sort of showing what the frame is. But the basic idea here is that we experimentally gave sort of a prime to people in nationally representative surveys where we said Putin is roughly as popular, if not more popular than you think he is. And then a negative frame where we said that, like, Putin's popularity was relatively low. And this was in 2021 when Putin's popularity was relatively low. So there's no deception here. So this is like just saying the exact same fact, but saying it in different ways. So like one, which is that saying that it's really high, and one saying it's the lowest it's ever been. And if we say that it's really high, there's basically no treatment effect. So basically, if you tell people that, or if you tell Russians that Putin's roughly as popular or he's very popular, their support for him doesn't increase. But if we say that Putin's popularity is lower than it has been, and it's been decreasing, then you get a treatment effect around 8% to, well, 6% to 12%, which means that if you just tell people that Putin's less popular among Russians than you might think, his support drops by around 6 to 12%, right? So this is an indication that, like, part, at least at this point in time, of Putin's support was based on the perception that he was popular.
So people would like to kind of fall within the same category as everyone else and answer what is widely done by others?
So that's an interesting question, right? Like, so what does it mean? Like, why would people change their perceptions? And this has been sort of an ongoing. So we unfortunately don't have any sort of data. We have a lot of, like, theories and ideas about why this is, and one of them is what you just mentioned. One of it also might just be that, like, if you think that everyone supports someone, you might assume that they have access to information. They might think he's capable. They might, like, know he's capable. And so you're going to sort of shift in line with that, right? And so, like, there's a bunch of different explanations for this, but it is evidence that, like, part of the reason why it's important to portray him, one of the reasons why it's so important, popularity is so important, is because it breeds popularity itself, right? So popularity is sort of self-reinforcing. And so, like, when people start thinking that he's less popular, then there might be a decrease.
And just finally, talking about these opinion polls, of course, if we compare the picture that we're drawing up for Russia now with the situation we know in a country like Norway, the interest in the approval ratings of the prime minister isn't really that great. What we really are interested is in the relationship between the different political parties. So I would be interested, are there other important kind of issues in the Russian opinion polls that you would like to draw out that would be of interest besides the popularity of the president himself?
Well, I mean, so I think that there's a lot of interesting information there. So, like, I mean, the key thing right now is support for the special military operation, right? So, like, that's sort of like, as I mentioned earlier, another sort of set of can of worms. So just sort of like, what does it mean to support the special military operation? Again, so in Russia, it's still referred to as a special military operation for a bunch of different reasons. But, like, asking something about that is, like, a sort of a key thing right now in Russian opinion polls.
Irina, we spoke a little bit about the opposition. Could you perhaps draw up what the main characteristics are of the political opposition in Russia today?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really have political power. So it tries to find some other forms of protest and tries to be creative about the protest. or discontents or opposition. So the internet has become the main place where opposition takes place, and informing the public is an important kind of mission that opposition has. And in this sense, we can see how the opposition kind of merges with journalism in a way. So, for example, Navalny's team has created, even though Navalny is in jail right now, his team has created this kind of media empire, and they try to inform the public. And the journalists and the independent journalists then also become a part of this opposition movement. So another, if we think about other characteristics, we can think about the fact that the Russian opposition is very often accused of is the fact that it's very fractious and contentious. So there is a lot of infighting, and that's, you know, another kind of discourse that Russian opposition is not successful because there is too much fighting within the opposition. Although, of course, this is probably not the main reason. So an example of this kind of fractious nature of the Russian opposition, we could see in the recent case when Navalny team tried to include into they have the list of sanctioned of the individuals that have to be sanctioned, and they wanted to include the former chief editor of Echo of Moscow. And Echo of Moscow is the independent radio station that was just closed right after the beginning of the war. So the Navalny's team see him as a pro-power person, pro-Kremlin person, even though he was a part of independent media. So they wanted to include him in the sanction list, and this created a big outrage on the internet. So again, this fractious nature of Russian opposition is usually expressed in the online fights, in the online scandals, the scandals in the social media.
I picked up on another thing you mentioned earlier, and now again you spoke about the relationship between the political opposition movement and the general population. You spoke about bydla massa earlier. This quite derogative term for the general uneducated, perhaps, public, and also now you spoke about the wish to educate the public, the general public, which is kind of a one direction movement from the opposition towards the public. To what extent is the political opposition in Russia able to pick up on and channel the things that take place in the broader public, the questions that they are concerned with?
Yeah, this is a great question. And again, this is probably hard to gauge exactly. Definitely, we could say that Navalny, when he was not in jail, was quite successful in picking up different questions. And we could see that by the way that the popularity of his online blogs was growing. So the YouTube channels were becoming more and more popular. His blog had 6 million subscribers, still has 6 million subscribers. And also, actually, the number of viewers was growing for something like TV Rain, which is another independent media source. So usually the way that the opposition likes to talk about this is that they have these blogs, they create these political blogs. The blogs are growing in popularity, and then they say, okay, we are seeing increase in our popularity, and then that means we are talking to more people, that we're addressing more people. But of course, the problem with this is that they are still addressing a small number of Russians, right? The Russians who are actively searching for the information online, and the Russians who are very active internet users. So in a way, because the opposition doesn't have access to television, for example, and television remains a very important media source for a lot of Russians, especially the older generation, then in a way they cannot, they are limited in their reach. And that's why they see the propaganda and the television in a very negative terms, and represented in very negative terms. There was also, I think, an interesting aspect of this when the war took place and the popularity of the war became obvious. There was also a sense of despair among the opposition because they felt that they didn't predict how popular the war would be and how effective the propaganda, or they believed that the propaganda was very important in influencing the perception of the war and the perception of Ukraine.
Is there any way to say anything about how popular the opposition is, Kyle, in terms of the polls?
I mean, so you can ask about individual figures, right? So like, as I showed you earlier, like when people were asking about Navalny, like his popularity was relatively low, right? And there's a bunch of things going on there. One is that, like, as Irina mentioned, he's basically banned from like television, right? So like a lot of people are definitely not aware of him, and to the extent that they're aware of him, they're aware that like the Russian government doesn't like him and has said bad things about him, right? And so like, this is sort of one of the sort of key things here is that like, when you ask about opposition figures, like generally they don't poll very highly, not necessarily because people don't like their message, not necessarily because people don't like them, but rather because people may not know about them. And also just that, yeah, they may not know them, they may not like their message, or they may not know their message, but know that they're not supposed to like them, right? And so like, there's a bunch of things going on there. So like from the public opinion data, I'd say, I don't know, like, I mean, again, like the best way, so one way of interpreting this would be to say like 1 minus support for Putin is the support for the opposition, right? And that would be one way of reading it. Again, based on the fact that we don't know exactly what support means, it makes it difficult to do something like that. But yeah, directly measuring, like, I'm not aware of any data. It would be surprising if someone has actually done this, but like, I'm not aware of any data where people have said like, do you support the activities of the opposition in Russia or something like that. Though obviously, like if you asked a question like that, I'm not entirely sure what that would mean either, right? Because there are a bunch of different oppositions. So the answer to your question is I don't know.
So I'd like to open for questions from the audience, both present here in the room and also if there are anyone online that would like to pose a question. So please feel free to raise a hand, and I'll pick up the question. We'll hear with the panelists. Have we picked up any questions from the online audience?
Yeah. You want to go first?
Please, Yaroslav.
What is it?
Yes.
Oh, very Yes, I have a question for both of speakers, and really thank you for your speech today. It was really interesting even for me because I was really involved in all of this, but you said very interesting thing. And I had a question about how can we, what can we say about real political action of most of Russian people? I mean, even their behavior when there is elections, for example, where they won elections of presidential elections, and how many real votes Putin really had in this time. And can we divide real votes from that kind of votes, which was like forced to do by authorities? Because, you know, some of people even working in education, they must to vote for what the head of the department say them, and they even have an opportunity to check, did you vote rightly? You know, so what can we say about real behavior of Russian just public? I mean, about everyone. So thank you.
Would you like to start, Kyle?
Sure. So this is a really important question, and again, like my answer is going to be like I don't know, because there's tremendous variation within Russia in terms of vote falsification. So you have places like Chechnya where like Putin, like the proportion of people who vote for Putin or Putin-backed parties is around 99%, right? And Chechnya is also probably the most autocratic region of Russia, right? And so yeah, what is political opinion in Chechnya is something that I think no one has a really good sense, at least based on public opinion data, right? And like you have sort of similar trends and similar sets of variation across regions within Russia, within like economic fields in Russia, right? So like factory bosses are better able to have people vote in different directions. Some oligarchs are better able to control the vote. Some regional political machines are better able to control the vote. So like actually coming up with like a single number that says like this is the actual number of votes that actually went toward Putin, honestly, is like is something that I think like would be very, very difficult to answer.
Would you have a take on that, Irina?
I just want to mention some interesting cases. As Kyle said, so there are some regions that are more that are called kind of electoral sultanates sometimes. So that are where elections really doesn't matter; they just write in the numbers. But then there are regions that seem a little bit freer. So, for example, usually the Far East, the Siberia, but also the Moscow, the city of Moscow itself could be seen as a freer region. And we could see an example of this with the so-called electronic voting system, right? When the last municipal elections, there were cases when a lot of municipal deputies won in the real election, but then after the electronic voting was counted, then it completely overturned the results. So here we can see obvious differences, but I agree with Kyle that it's very difficult to measure. We cannot just subtract and divide and see what's really going on.
Just to follow up on that, Irina, does that mean that there is no way of falsifying the counting of the electoral votes? What was going on?
You mean in Moscow?
Yeah, you were talking about how the electoral, the digital voting was.
So they probably falsified it in the real physical election places, but they added more falsification when the electronic voting. That was a kind of a new election system introduced in the last municipal voting. And that's actually why Venediktov was accused by Navalny's team, because he supported this electronic voting system.
And was there another question from the audience at the very back, and then we can move forward? There's a couple of questions here. So Johanna first.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very interesting panel. My question is kind of related to how we talk about criticism of the regime, right? Because we always talk about it in terms of, the opposition and the, let's say, liberal elite. But we know that in relation to the war, a lot of criticism has come from, let's say, the more extreme parts of Russian society, the military bloggers and the hawks, let's say, the people who want the regime, or especially the military, to do even more extreme stuff in Ukraine. So I'm wondering how you think about the role of those voices who are not what we traditionally think about as critical voices or opposition, but still very much are criticizing what's happening right now. And then also I was wondering, maybe Kyle, you could talk a little bit about, because the numbers you've shown us about support, they are at the aggregate level, right? But we know that there are differences between generations and regions. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
I would like to take all the three questions we had before you get the chance to reply. So Louise and then Nadine.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel today. My name is Louise. I'm a researcher at TMI. I was curious about whether you know of recent studies more on the kind of grassroots, everyday resistance of Russians. I mean, in authoritarian regimes or societies, a lot of the kind of engagement from people would not be along formal lines. It would be more like discrete actions of showing their resistance in more informal ways. Are there any studies showing this? That was one question, sorry about that. I have another one, and that is about Russian diaspora in Europe. Since the war, have you seen any changes in the way the Russian government is dealing with the diaspora? Is there any active mobilization among the Russian diaspora? And does it vary across Europe on this? It's a very big question, I know, but very tempting to ask.
Thank you, Louisa. And then the final question here at the front with Lina.
Yes, thank you for the very insightful conversation. So the picture you're kind of portraying is that Putin's popularity is quite stable, and that also the political regime as such is quite stable. So my question would be how and if war has changed anything for the politics of Russia, as it doesn't seem that any changes are coming about. And the same for the society. Has it really changed anything for Russian society? Of course, we have seen big waves of people leaving Russia and so on, but those who are remaining, what then? What has it changed? Thank you.
Thank you all for these questions. I'm afraid that will be the questions we'll be able to answer today. We tried to go into the very details of things, and now we are talking on a very, very global level. Thank you for really good questions. We had one about the more extreme opposition to the politics of Putin. The first question from Johanna, is that something you would be prepared to answer, Irina?
Yeah, I would try to. So definitely we can see this a lot of activities from the radical nationalists, we could say. That is, they are very active in Telegram, especially online and especially on Telegram. And they also have their kind of political spokesmen, such as Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, the governor of Chechnya, and Prigozhin, who is this kind of shady figure, who is head of this private military organization, Wagner. So I think it's important also to remember that this represents, basically, we could describe them as imperial nationalists, right? So they are nationalists who also have these very imperial aspirations. And so they're kind of, on one hand, Russian government always had very strange relationship with nationalists. They at times repressed them, put them into jail, and at times they invited them into the government. We could think about Zakhar Prilepin as the most recent example. He was the leader of the party and then became part of a parliament member. And so now these nationalists, they are very happy about the invasion. They're very happy about the war in Ukraine, but they just don't feel that it's going the right way. That, like, they want the nuclear weapons, they want Armageddon, and when these things do not happen, then they are not happy. So that's a very kind of brief description of their messages, I would say.
There was also a question about the more detailed level of the opinion polls and the support for Putin. Is there a rather short answer to that?
Rather short. Well, yeah. So there are definitely demographics that support Putin more than others. So like younger people tend to be much less supportive of Putin than older people, right? Like that's the biggest stylized fact I can give you. There's also a fair amount of regional variation, right? So Khabarovsk is much less supportive of Putin than, say, a place like Russian-occupied Crimea, right? And so in public opinion data. And so I think that there is, like, it is worth noting, as you did, that like on aggregate, like popularity is very high, but there are some populations and some very important populations that are not supportive of him, right? Or at least not as supportive. And so thinking about that is really important, right? So you also have educational variation, you also have variation in rural versus urban centers. All of these are sort of things that are like important aspects of support for Putin. And the other thing that is worth noting is kind of also in line with what Irina mentioned is historically, at least, like people who are very much on the far right and far right nationalism tended to be less supportive of Putin. Like not again, like during the war, I'm not aware of any information about this particular population and support for Putin and how that has changed over time. And my guess would be that it jumped after the invasion, and then it has been decreasing as the war has gone, not as planned, right? And I think that is sort of like the key thing to Alina's question, which is like, how has the war changed things in Russia? And the answer is I'm positive it has, but in ways that are very unpredictable, right? So I think like the key thing that I see now in Russia at sort of like in general is much greater unpredictability than there used to be, right? So I think the initial intention with the war was to have it done relatively quickly, relatively successfully, and then increase popularity that would provide for like further alterations and further continuation of the system. Given that things are not going as planned, that just means that there's a whole lot more uncertainty about what's actually happening, right? So you have these sort of far-right nationalists who have been allowed to speak more freely than anti-war activists per se, and now sort of going more and more in sort of a critical direction toward the government, right? And that's sort of something that leads to, again, more unpredictability, because what are these people going to actually do? At what point will they actually turn on the government? Is sort of, well, so they've turned on actors within the government, but they haven't turned on Putin per se. And so like, at what point does that happen? Does that happen? Is it possible? Are questions that we weren't expecting to be asking, but now we are, right? Also similarly within like Kremlin politics. So there's been a lot of jokes about how we've gone back to sort of like the Soviet like system or Soviet political science, where we're like seeing who's standing next to Putin and what point, like who's on the Zoom call, and like what is the tone. So like I think that's like opaque, and so no one actually knows exactly what's going on. But I think like the fact that like Putin seems to have lost some of his aura of invincibility is something that again like leads to questions about the stability of the government.
There is one final question I would like to pick up from Louisa about the research on popular resistance, Irina. Is that something that you would be able to say something about, either research or examples of such popular resistance?
I would say that it's too early for the research. If we think about the resistance to the war, but definitely what we can see the tendencies is that a lot of grassroots activities in immigration or initiatives in immigration. So I actually mentioned some of those, the kind of attempts to create different communities online to help people who are trying to immigrate, for example, different feminist groups that try to speak against the war and maybe create, some of them are located abroad, but they also encourage activities such as, for example, there was a very interesting movement where people replaced the price tags in the stores with anti-war messages. And there is a prominent case of one artist, Alexandra Skucharenko, who was jailed for this activity. But also the one that I mentioned, the mobilization creates a lot of grassroots activities, but we don't quite yet see what will happen to it, like how it will develop, because it's just at the beginning of this movement.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Kyle. There were some questions left unanswered. I think that means that we'll have to create a new breakfast meeting at some point to be able to discuss the developments in Russia further. I'd like to thank the audience here today and online for your patience and all the good questions, and wish you all a good Wednesday here in Berlin. Thank you.